Hey,
I've
Dad
always-
worked for Nestle. Dad worked for Nestle, mate. The free kick out today didn't really work too well.
This is potentially the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. And that's saying something, because there's been some stupid stuff in the history of it.
For me, what was the most rewarding, just learning, taking stuff out of them, and also being given this platform to be able to stand up and represent people of my time.
The only way really to keep poverty in the butt at all is through education, and I probably didn't realise until I went there.
Sure, they should back you. It's water cooler weekly. I mean, it's a big deal.
When I introduce people, normally it's straightforward. I can just give a title and a name and it just goes through smooth. But for you, unfortunately, I can't, because we've got you on for many different reasons. So I'm just going to say welcome, Andrew Sturgess, to the Water Cooler Weekly podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chris. And you're probably not the only one that thinks on that line. And we might talk a little bit about why I jump into different sort of things a little bit later on. But my mother will actually like hearing that opening. So thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure. You're sort of a jack of all trades, and the pleasure is all mine to have you on. First off, what we're going to do is we'll touch on you run your own podcast called Emergence, which sort of came about through COVID, and as you touched on before, you sort of had a little bit more time, and you were able to speak to certain people. Before I list off a couple of names, which are pretty big names, did you want to talk about maybe the thought process behind starting it and sort of what you wanted to achieve?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I started a podcast in 2020, at the start of 2020, which was obviously the year that COVID-19 took the world by storm and was pretty unprecedented. And I think people sort of had to adapt and work on the fly. And for mine, it came Emergence. The podcast was sort of born out of the fact that football coaching for me is my purpose and where I want to end up in life. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, I'm sure. But the 2020 VFL season was cancelled altogether in the end due to COVID-19. And obviously Victoria had some of the harshest lockdowns in the world. And so therefore football probably wasn't going to go ahead. And for me, it was a little bit of a gap filler to give me some purpose in my life, to allow me to continue to learn and pick the minds of some pretty high credential people, and for me to continue to refine my craft. And I think what I was hoping to get out of it was exactly that, for me to get better in my practice, so then I could bring some stuff into 2021 that are hopefully going to help my club and our program to be better. And that's what we're continually striving to do. But through these conversations that I started to have and I started to record, as I said, was probably for my own personal benefit to begin with, but I found them really beneficial, and that's probably a little bit self-indulgent, but I thought the world was suffering. It was surrounded by negativity. There was a lot of doom and gloom, people losing jobs, a lot of despair. And I thought if I could share these out to other people, and I had no idea, by the way, of how to actually run a podcast. My first few episodes, I didn't have a microphone. The recording and the editing is absolutely horrendous. And thankfully, my wife, Bianca, helped me out with that a little bit and sort of showed me the platform for where to go and where to put them. And then I just started sharing them in the hope that if it benefited one person, or they got something out of it that helped them or fulfilled their day or gave them a positive outlook on life as opposed to the negativity we were surrounded in, then that was my aim as well. But the feedback that I got from the podcast and the episodes and the people that I had on was just the authentic nature of the conversations. It wasn't construed. I wasn't trying to grab a headline or get more followers or whatever. It was all, for me, that's what I stuck to. My main purpose was, what questions can I ask to draw information out that's going to make me a better coach, a better leader, a better mentor, a better father, a better husband? And a byproduct of that is it actually benefited a lot of the audience, because they're probably in the similar boat to me, or coaches, sports people, teachers, leaders that are wanting to get better themselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just going to mention a couple of names here. And when I list the names, it won't be a shock to anyone that, there were multiple people who were able to take stuff out of these conversations you've had. So you've had Justin Langer, Brent Harvey, Jason Ackermanis, Elise Filiani, Sam Mitchell, just to name a few. Those are pretty pretty impressive and pretty high level, some of our best sporting athletes in the country. Like, how do you start those conversations? Is there a part of you that's almost a little bit overwhelmed?
To be perfectly honest with you, Chris, no, because I've always viewed people as people, and I've never looked at people as titles or status or they're better than me or they're worse than me. I've always had a view that people are people and they're level playing field. And what I've found is by actually seeking out and asking the questions, and you mentioned Justin Langer there, off air, Justin Langer, when we finished our conversation, actually said to me, stay in touch. I like what you're doing. I like the fact that you had the courage to ask, because a lot of people don't. And I think that's the difference, is people probably might look at Brent Harvey or Sam Mitchell or Elise Villani or Justin Langer, those people that you mentioned, Ben McAvoy, Will Tomlinson, the boxer, and think, well, I probably can't ask them because maybe I'm not in their circle, or maybe I'm not in that professional space, professional sporting space, whatever it is. But actually, people are really willing to help and to assist if you're coming from a place, as I said before, of authenticity, of, hey, I want to learn, I want to get better, I want to improve, and I think you can help me do that. And there was no agenda attached to it, as I mentioned earlier. And so therefore, these people were quite willing to come on board. Now, I was quite lucky that I've been involved in that sort of circle of semi-professional, professional sport for a little bit, and had some contacts that were able to set me up with people like Justin Langer. Elise Villani, I was lucky enough to grow up with, playing cricket against her, funny enough, and she's a good friend of my wife's. So I was able to get some contact to these people through other people that I had. But really, I think it comes down to just having the courage to ask the question. And then once you're in the conversation, as we are today, Chris, it's just all about you and I, hopefully getting something out of it for people that are listening, but also for ourselves to actually learn and to grow. And I'll review this, how I spoke today, and think, how can I do it better? I'm sure that you'll review and say, did I ask the right questions to draw out the right information? And if everybody has that mindset of continual growth, the world's just going to be a better place.
No, absolutely. And I think one thing you said there, two things you said actually, is the fact that, when you started this, you weren't really sure about how to do it. You didn't have a microphone. You didn't really know. And I think a lot of what I've done, obviously, I haven't had the sort of high caliber guests that you've had on, because that's not sort of what I'm going for. But I sort of had no idea either. And a lot of it is literally just, you put something out, all right, get feedback from people, look around, see what other people are doing, and just take little parts of what other things are and constantly adapt. And I mean, I look back to the first episode I did with a good friend of mine, Sean Sturgess, who played at Melbourne Cricket Club. And I look back to say the episode I did with the former treasurer of Australia, Chris Bowen. And I'm like, those are almost worlds apart. And they were literally, from episode 1 to episode 10. So I think it is a very interesting thing. And you have to be reflective, and you have to sort of adapt on what you're doing. Otherwise, you're almost going through the motions, you could say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you made a really good point there. And we both reflected on it, even just in this conversation. I'm sure it's something that we both didn't plan to talk about, was the fact that we both weren't entirely ready, or we weren't experts in the podcast game, so to speak. But I think in any field of life or anything that you're trying to achieve, if you're looking for the opportune moment, for all the ducks to be in a row, for you to then say, okay, now I'm ready, you're probably never going to be ready. And you're probably never going to actually take that leap of faith and just jump into it and learn as you go and get better as you go and learn by making mistakes. And that's life. We make mistakes and we learn and we improve. We do that from childhood. We learn how to be socially acceptable. We learn, what's right and wrong through our parents, through our environment. So it's the same as when we get to adults. Unfortunately, though, we're less willing to take risks. And maybe it comes out of fear of what other people might say, that we jumped into something, it didn't work, bad luck, you're a failure, or that we ourselves are too scared to actually jump in and have a go. But I think anything that you do, if you're waiting for the opportune moment, as I said, to jump in and have a crack, you're probably never going to take that leap of faith.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think and I'm not going to lie and say that there isn't a part of me going, in my head where I'm like, I don't want to be a failure, because, I think everyone to a certain extent is sort of, how would you say, they do worry about public perception, whether it's something that occupies their mind, all day and all night, or for a brief moment in the day while you're drinking a latte. I think it still happens. And for me, it wasn't necessarily about, and this is, I'd be interested to see what your thought is, because you have had, some guests, like you said, that aren't household names, but probably should be. And there's one in particular I want to touch on, but I don't really care about the views or the listens that I get from a personal point of view, but a lot of the guests that I have on are sharing very intimate, and they're being very open with their story, and it's their story, and a lot of it is their life story. I want people to listen for them, because they deserve that. They don't deserve to have, 4 or 5 people listen to that and sort of, have no follow-up. Like, I want people to listen because I believe the stories that I'm sharing are worthwhile listening. And I'd be interested to see what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that you said there around about nobody wants to fail, which I think is true. There's some part of us that is scared to fail, but I suppose that's defining what failure is. Brené Brown does a lot of work around sort of courage and vulnerability, and she uses the terminology "man in the arena," which is a speech made by Teddy Roosevelt, former US president, and he talks in this speech about the courage or the credit should go to the person that's willing to put themselves out there, that's willing to be in the arena, getting their butt kicked, putting themselves on the line, not to the people that are in the stands with the cheap seats, willing to throw taunts and give feedback, but they're not actually willing to put themselves in that arena themselves. And so I think people that say, "Oh, I don't care about what anybody says. I don't care about what anybody says," they're probably lying to themselves. And it's actually okay for you to care about what people think, but you get choice as to who those people are. Mm-hmm. And Brené Brown has this other activity. It's called a square squad. And so what you do is you get a 5 by 5 centimeter piece of paper, and you might write down 10 people's names that really matter to you in life, that their opinion, it counts. And anybody outside of that, it's just noise. So then that takes the failure, the pressure, the social anxiety or peer pressure out of the equation, because you're actually focusing on, well, what's your aim of this podcast? And you articulated that beautifully about saying, well, this is mine, is to tell these people's stories. And I don't care how many listens I get. I don't care what comes of it from a financial perspective or sponsorship or publicity or anything like that. You're actually there to tell somebody's story. And that aligns heavily to what I was doing. It was for me to learn, but then also for me to be able to tell other people's stories. And people like Justin Langer and Sam Mitchell, people are going to know their stories because of their title. They're in the public spotlight, and particularly my audience being a sporting audience, people know them. But there's other people that I've had on my show, like Joel Sardi, for example, who was a former army veteran who come home from service in Afghanistan and fell down a flight of stairs and is now a quadriplegic. And his story is just so inspirational, because he talks about the first 3 years of being a quadriplegic. And you think about it, he was 21 years old at the time, and went from living a normal life, a really fit, young, healthy man, obviously in the army, purpose, knows his direction where he's going, to becoming a quadriplegic. And he talks about the hardship and the despair, and probably almost, in essence, wanting to remove himself from that life, to the point where he turned around and said, well, I control what I control, and I control my future, and I can achieve anything I want. And it's those stories that are really inspiring, that you feel privileged as a host that you actually get to share. So, I completely agree with you that there's an element that you want to learn, and it's your show, but there's also the other element and the other side of it, that you get to hear other people's stories and be inspired by that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good segue there, because I mentioned before, obviously, we mentioned some of the sporting names with Justin Langer, Brent Harvey, etc. But there's one guest that you've had on that I was incredibly interested in, and that's Professor Ricky Johnston, who is the head of the Gene Regulation Laboratory at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Center. Now, that's obviously far removed from sport, and you could argue that that's probably one of the most important conversations you could have, because that's a man who is literally doing all he can to save lives every day. I would love to know sort of, the the approach you took into that, as opposed to say the approach you took to the other guests that you've had on from a sporting nature?
Yeah. So for Ricky, for example, he was really lucky. I mentioned before that I've been quite fortunate that I've had connections to people that have been able to put me in contact with these people that I've had on the show. And Ricky is from Preston, and that's where my family grew up. My mum and my uncles and my auntie grew up in Preston. I still have family that live in Preston now. And Preston now, it's actually, talk about real estate location. It's a fantastic spot to live, and the market prices going up. Are you from Preston, Chris?
I'm from Eltham, but
Eltham, okay.
I live in Northcote, so I've looked around at prices, and well, it's all out of my price range. I need to look at Wallen Way or Donald or something close to the border.
Oh, very good. But he's from Preston, grew up with my family, and so Preston back in the day was actually quite a workman-like, probably low socioeconomic status community. My family themselves didn't grow up with a lot of money. Ricky's father passed away when he was young, and mother worked several jobs to get him by and get him to where he wanted to be in life. And his story is quite inspirational because he's come from a place so low to get to where he got to and go to Harvard Medical School and to study there. And now, as you said, be a professor for quite an important cause and highly regarded, highly intelligent. But for him, it was all about telling his story of where he started, where he got to, but how he remained so grounded throughout it all. And he actually never forgot his roots. And I think sometimes that's what people do, unfortunately, is the more power they get, the more fame they get, the status becomes greater. They go away from actually what got them there. And Ricky's story for mine, being able to tell it and hear from him, was just a great reminder again for me, and a great learning for me is I've got ambitions, again, we're going to talk about this, to coach AFL. I want to be an AFL senior coach. But I always need to remember that my junior football started at St Mary's Junior Football Club. My cricket club, Don Creek Cricket Club, have instilled a lot of great values and beliefs in me that I want to carry throughout my tenure as coach at Coburg Football Club, and then hopefully on to higher honours as well. I've got to remember that Bundoora Football Club were the first club to give me a senior coaching opportunity. I've got to remember Coburg Football Club took me in and gave me some games, and there have been some great people that have given me opportunities on the way. And just to always remain grounded to how you got to where you got to, because I think that once you sort of lose that, you probably forget who you are, and then you're not becoming authentic.
Yeah, you start to listen to the hype, and that's sort of where you get away from especially when we're talking about it from a coaching sense. Like, you need to have your head in the game and essentially not up your own ass. So I think that's a really good way to segue into the coaching side of it. And you just touched on there that, you're the head coach for Coburg in the VFL. I'm assuming it's still called the VFL with the expansion into the East. Yeah.
Yep.
So I think it's fascinating, to know that you say you coached at Bundoora, and, that's a league that I played footy in. And we mentioned beforehand how shit I was at footy. So to the fact that you were coaching at that league, and I've got a good friend of mine, Mick Misson, who's coaching in the same league, who probably has very similar aspirations to you. Talk about what that process is, sort of moving up the the ladder one step at a time, essentially.
Yeah, I'll probably want to start by saying that I've been quite fortunate that opportunities have probably come about for me at the right time. And to give an example of that, I played football at Eltham Football Club in the Northern Football League, and was looking to take my football to the next level as a player. And this was back in 2013, 2014. And so Coburg Football Club at the time were cutting their alignment with the Richmond Football Club, and they were looking for some players. So I went down and did a trial day, was lucky enough to get invited to pre-season, got a contract within 2 weeks. And then by the end of pre-season was in the leadership group and played every game of the 2014 season in the seniors. And then the 2015 season, I had an unfortunate injury, which sort of marred my run of being able to play games of football. Ended up playing 21 VFL games across 2 years. That was it. And so from a resume perspective, I'm coaching against guys now like Gary Ayres, who's won 2 Norm Smith medals and 5 premierships. I'm coaching against guys like Andy Collins, who's not a senior coach anymore, but has a fantastic resume, 3 premierships at Hawthorn, coaching against guys like Mark Williams. There's some good coaches with some incredible playing resumes that I'm against. But I was quite fortunate that in the 2 years that I played at Coburg, I played under a guy named Peter German, who was my coach, who saw something in me as a leader, as a teacher, as a future coach that he really liked. And I went and played 1 year at Seymour in 2016 and just played, and then was going to do the same thing in 2017. And he gave me a call out of the blue and said, look, you're probably going to have to cut your playing career short, but I think you could be a fantastic coach in the future. So would you like to be our midfield coach this year and share your duties of playing and coaching at Coburg and Seymour? And I initially said no, and it was actually my wife, Bianca, that said, you're stupid. This is a great opportunity. It's come about for a reason. You should jump at it and take it. And I quickly turned around and called Peter back and said, look, I'd love to do it. And so that's where my coaching journey started. I was 26 or 27 at the time, and I was an assistant coach of a VFL club. That was my first coaching role. So most people have to work from junior football through to senior reserves, through to senior assistant coach, through to senior coach, and then they get an opportunity to maybe go to NAB League and then to VFL, and then if they're good enough, they'll get to AFL. It's a long and arduous journey, and I've been quite fortunate, as I said, that was my starting point, was as a senior assistant coach at a VFL club. And from there, I coached there for 2 years as the assistant coach, and it was probably at the end of the 2019 season, I said, okay, well, what's my next progression? And again, quite fortunate that Lee Adams and Seb Spagnuolo, who's the general manager at Coburg, said, we think that you can coach at this level or higher as a senior coach, but you need to be able to coach your own team. So why don't you go back and coach at a local club? So I started looking around. I was playing at Bundoora now, by the way. And again, really fortunate that the opportunity just arose that the coach at the time at Bundoora, Ricky Dyson, was looking to step up to VFL and be an assistant coach at Essendon Football Club, left the vacancy there. And so I slotted straight in and took over. So it wasn't that I applied and then I went against all these different people. Again, I was just in the right place at the right time. And then that led me, I did 1 year at Bundoora. Same thing. Lee Adams got an assistant coaching role at North Melbourne, left the vacancy for the senior role open at Coburg. I'd played there. I'd been an assistant coach there. I'd gone back and done my 1 year of senior coaching. So I ticked that off on my resume. Opportunity just arose at the right time. And so therefore I was able to jump in and pick it up from there. So I've been quite lucky that's sort of happened for me, but I also believe that you make your own luck, and I've worked really hard, and I'm always one that's trying to improve, which I hopefully come through today. And I think sometimes opportunities come about for people that are like-minded like that. So that's sort of where I'm at now. But in terms of progressing along and how you step up, I think that's just what you've got to keep doing, is actually seeking opportunities, reaching out to people, connecting with people. I know Mick, you mentioned before, he actually reached out to me and just said, I like your podcast. And we conversed a little bit via email about coaching. And that's all it takes really, is to actually connect with somebody that might be a level above you. It doesn't matter how they got there. And to just say, hey, I'd be willing to learn. And how did you get to where you are? And what can I do? Or what can I be doing more of? And people, I know I am certainly, I'd prefer to have a bunch of assistant coaches that don't necessarily have a playing resume or even the best coaches, but they've got a desire to get better and improve and invest in the program, because you know what you're going to get out of them. And what you can then teach them is the capacity and the how to coach. Like, you can build that over time. What you can't teach or what you can't instill in people is actually hard work and dedication and commitment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really interesting point you sort of just make there, is because a few years ago, I moved over to Canada to try and sort of make a bit of a career in ice hockey. And what I was doing was working as a scout. Obviously, coming from Australia, ice hockey is about as big as a bull ant. And, I just didn't have that sort of, I knew this person, I knew that person, I knew nobody. So I emailed, messaged anyone I could, and I got one meeting. And it was with the general manager of a major junior team in Ottawa, this was a pretty big meeting. For essentially, it's essentially a TAC Cup team almost. So I sat down with him and, you know, we chatted for about an hour, and he said, look, it's really, you know, it's really interesting and you've definitely got the knowledge, but, you know, the problem is you can't just jump into that. He's like, you know, there's, you know, 400 blokes and girls who want to do the exact same thing as you. They have the same amount of knowledge, but they're prepared to work this hard for an opportunity. And so I essentially had to go away. Through that, I was able to get two scouting jobs where I had to, for 9 months, bust my ass. And, you know, most of the time I look like an absolute dickhead because a lot of it was going to the rink, talking to people who you knew worked for teams just to introduce yourself. And a lot of the times they looked at you like, okay, nice to meet you. Like, cool. Like, they wouldn't give you the time of day. But it really was one of those things where you just had to make that sort of network group, so that you could say, you know, when an opportunity comes up, they're like, oh, I remember that like Australian guy with the creepy mustache who was, you know, he said a couple of good things. And then that's how you get your foot in the door somewhat. And so like, while I appreciate what you say, you're lucky to have these opportunities, but you know, that they don't just, we're talking about the VFL level here. They don't just, you know, hand these sort of jobs out, you know, if it's not worthwhile. So I think it's interesting that you can recognize that A, you're very lucky and fortunate, but B, that you also deserve to be there.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what it is. I'm extremely grateful that I've been given those opportunities, and I'm also quite understanding that I have the capacity to grow and to get better and to improve, and that I am a VFL level ready coach. And when I say a VFL level ready coach, that doesn't mean that I know it all. I'm always improving, and I don't think anybody's ever going to figure out the game of AFL. It's always evolving. There's new rules being brought in, new strategies that coaches are implementing. Opposition are putting tactics in front of you that you have to work with. So nobody's ever going to have it all figured out. But yeah, I think for me, my journey of getting to where I am right now has been, in comparison to a lot of other people, quite short and sharp. So I'm always reflective of that and always grateful, as I said, of the opportunities that have come my way, but also understanding that I'm in there at the moment and I'm not just sitting there going, oh, it's great to be here. I'm grateful. I'm not ready. Like, I feel like I'm ready and that I can get better. And to your point about, and your example of, you know, you putting yourself out there, I think, again, I mentioned it before, I'd prefer to work with people of that mindset, that are willing to come and say, well, this is what I'm prepared to do and whatever. And then you know their name, and what you can figure out over time is, okay, well, they're willing to work hard. Do they have the capabilities now? And that's what you can sort of figure out. But if you've got somebody that has a fantastic resume, but they're lazy, or they're not going to put the work in, or they're inconsistent in their commitment, it doesn't matter how good they are. There's going to be a part of the players that are missing out on a coach that they require that commitment, that regularity of feedback and whatever. And if they're not able to do that because they're sitting on their resume, then they're probably not the right person to have in your program.
Yeah, no, it's one thing you touched on there is that you never stop learning. I'd be interested to know, as a coach, how often do you say, watch video or develop your philosophy? Because, you know, the game is ever changing, obviously, with the rules and whatnot, whether that should be happening or not. As a coach, you don't have any say. So you have to continuously develop yourself.
Yeah. So on the philosophy part, my philosophy won't ever change. And my philosophy stems from the work that I did at the juvenile prison as a teacher, Parkfield College. And again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but I think people, when they sit down, they write their coaching philosophies, they write a thesis, and it's just so much, but you've got to identify what matters to you. And then there's going to be stuff that, you know, encompasses your philosophy. So mine coaching philosophy is simply treat a person as they are, they'll remain as they are. Treat a person as what they could be, they'll become what they should be. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of layers to that I know of, but on the surface, essentially having the belief that every person can get better, not judging them on their past, not judging them on where they're at the moment, but having a future outlook for them that they can improve and get better. And things that encompass that are unconditional positive regard, genuineness, empathy, growth mindset. And that's my coaching philosophy. And the tactics and the game plan and the vision and all that, that's actually separate to how I want to treat people.
Mhm.
So there's how you want to treat people, there's how you want to set up an environment and a culture, and then there's how do you actually go about reviewing and moving people along a technical and tactical continuum. So for us, our training is quite, I'm a teacher by trade, as I just mentioned, and we have a massive learning environment. So our drills and our training week to week is really consistent. So what we're trying to give the players is predictability of the same drills, the same structure to the week. And so therefore they're not coming to training thinking what's going to happen, what are we going to do tonight? They've got a really clear understanding of what to expect when they get to training. And so therefore what they need to do is just really nail down the key coaching points. So we scaffold our training. Essentially, we'll have the same drill or the same concepts that we want to hit on throughout our 3 or 4 drills throughout the night. But what we're just adding in is different complexities, different challenges, and different scenarios that they have to adapt to. The concepts of what we're actually trying to get out of it are exactly the same from a defensive or offensive perspective, but the challenges and the complexities of the drills, they're the only things that really change.
Yeah, right. Do you think that translate to success on a Saturday? Because obviously, if you've got players who continuously, they say they know what to expect in training. If you make those drills structure based and all that sort of thing, come Saturday, there might be a large part of the overwhelming feeling from a player's point of view that's essentially removed because they know what's going on, they're confident, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're trying to do is, and we obviously didn't get to play any games last year. So we didn't actually get a good look at what our training structure looks like leading into games. But I read a great book called Legacy, which I've based a lot of my coaching around. And it's of that, treat a person as they are, they'll remain as they are, treat a person as they could be, they'll become what they should be. But in the book, it's based around the New Zealand All Blacks, who are the most successful sporting team in the history. They've got, I think, an 87% winning percentage or something ridiculous. And the way that they actually set up their week is predictability. So they do the same thing week after week after week after week. But what they do is early on in the week, it's based around vision, learning, reflection on the weekend's game, the previous game that they've played, a lot of coaching, a lot of instruction. So the coach or the teacher or the educator is essentially running the sessions. And then as it gets closer to game day, there's less coaching, less instruction. It's more about solidifying and confirming what people's individual roles are within the system. We'll back off the coaching. And then by game day, it should be about the players, because I have this view, if you're doing too much coaching or you're on the phone too much in the box or you're giving too much instruction on game day, there's probably something going wrong. You're trying to probably fix something rather than the players understanding and knowing what they need to do and going out and implementing it.
Yeah, and then to add on to that, there's almost sometimes especially when you're playing a game like Australian rules, because it is so sort of there's so much information to take in that sometimes if you've got the runner coming out 4 or 5 times in a quarter, like I used to, telling you stuff, you're almost like, well, then your mind starts to go all over the place. You're like, oh shit, like, do I do this or do I do that? And you're essentially, you're out to sea.
I agree. And that's the runner's an interesting one because the game moves so quickly as well. And so by the time the runner gets out to you to give you a message, you might not even have any idea of what the runner's talking about because your mind's actually moved on to the next phase. So he might be giving an instruction based on something you did 3 minutes ago that you've actually already forgotten about. And it's interesting you mentioned about there's so much information to take in. I think the game moved that way for a period of time where it becomes so complicated and probably information overload that we lost the natural flair and abilities that these players have. And I think Richmond Football Club have been a prime example of that over the last 3 years, about really stripping it back, allowing the players to have fun, creating an environment where people feel safe and supported. And then the football side of it is the simplicity of their game plan. And I think if you were to ask any of our players or anyone at our club, we've tried to emulate a similar environment without copying. A lot of our philosophies and our culture is built on things that I've learned through my experiences teaching in a youth prison. But the simplicity of the game plan, the simplicity of individual roles, that's what we want players going into a game knowing and feeling confident in, not being overwhelmed or having information coming left, right, and centre, and actually figuring out, well, what do I use at what point in time? We want to try and make it really clear for them.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think you do have to take some aspects from, say, a Richmond or a Port Adelaide, really successful clubs, because like football's been around for hundreds of years, right? Like you're not going to wake up tomorrow morning. I'm sorry if you think you might, but you're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and go, oh my God, I've just got an idea that, no one else has ever got. And I look at it the same in how I approach this in podcasting. I listen to so many podcasts that are a similar kind of format, because they do little things that I'm like, I just never would have thought about it. Like Dylan Buckley, who played for Carlton and GWS, he has an absolutely incredible podcast. And I take a lot of his mannerisms and the questions that he asks and the way he has such free-flowing conversations with people. And I take a lot of stuff out of that and sort of say, okay, well, how can I incorporate that into, say, a chat like this, or a chat like, I've got a professional golfer who played in the PGA Tour coming up in a couple of weeks. How do I approach it to that? And I think you have to do that to some extent. Like you obviously tailor it to your needs, but you do need to grab parts from different, parts of the different aisles of the supermarket to get things to work.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I had that exact same conversation with Sam Mitchell when I had him on Emergence, one of my episodes, and I asked him that. I said, how do you find the balance of being relevant and staying up with what other teams and what the trends are in the game, but then also being a trendsetter? And he said, well, it is a fine balance. And at Hawthorn, he spoke about that they would try things and they would train it for weeks and weeks and weeks and think that they were going to bring something new into the game. One of them, for example, was instead of manning up at a centre bounce, their defenders going next to their opponents, they were going to try and zone and guard space. And they got the first 3 goals kicked against them, so they quickly scrapped that. So I think, but if you're not willing to have the courage to try something new or to be a trendsetter, you're probably always going to be a step behind. So there is that balance of staying relevant and keeping up with what other people are doing and picking little parts of the different aisles at the supermarket, was the term you used, but then also ensuring that you've got your own flavour and you've got your own trends that you're wanting to bring into, for my example, football.
Yeah, the zone and the 3 goals is a really interesting thing that you just mentioned, because the way that I think, right, I'm probably too much of a let's just go for it sort of person, whereas sometimes I probably need to pull back a little bit. But my view is, and let's use it for that concept, manning up has, I've seen teams get 3 goals kicked on them very quickly when manning up was used, as opposed to the zone. So, well, mainly when I was playing fullback. So if you can't say, oh, look, we tried this, but we gave up 3 goals. It's like, well, yeah, we didn't try that, and we gave up 18 goals last week. So it is an interesting mindset where, you're sort of like, you stick to something that you just know for so long. And then you try something and you're like, no, it doesn't work. But the results are like very similar.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're going to make mistakes when you try something new and you put something out there. But that's the beauty of football. And we have a really simple process at our club: review, learn, improve. And that's all it is. As long as we've gone out and we've tried our best and we've tried to implement what we've asked, what the coaches have asked of the players, if they've tried to do that, we're not identifying or we're not reviewing players on did we win or lose. And unfortunately, we're in an industry where that's probably the number one column that a lot of people outside the arena, they look at. Inside the arena, we're looking at did we meet our KPIs? Did we meet our game plan? Did we play our roles? And that's what we review players on. And a lot of football clubs now, within their best and fairest, we used to have the old 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 voting system. Whereas now most clubs actually have every player is judged on their role. So every player has the capacity to earn 5 votes if they perform their role to a 5 out of 5 standard. And I think that's where the game's going. And I think that's good, because what it allows is it depends who you talk to and what generation you talk to. But for mine, I really like watching the game today because I understand the tactics and the strategies and what's happening and people playing their roles. And they might not necessarily be Dustin Martin, the superstar of the game, or Tony Lockett in yesteryear, where we're seeing 14, 15 goals kicked in a day. But there's guys playing their role that you can sort of go, that's fantastic. I'd love them in my team. And then you review them on how well they've played their role.
Important to note that I played almost an entire year of reserves football, and I came 26th in our best and fairest. So it's just an important thing to recognize that the 5-4-3-2-1 system doesn't work, because I probably should have finished a lot lower than 26th. So
a lot of players.
Yeah. Mate, when you get beaten by 200 points every week, you get a lot of nuffies. A lot of nuffies show up to play one game and then they head off, especially when you're playing Diamond Creek, who put 90 on you in the first quarter. But anyway, it is what it is. I'm better for it. So you mentioned you're a teacher by trade. So we'll move into that, because a lot of those characteristics that you've talked about in coaching do sort of stem from the fact that you are a teacher and that you've had some interesting teaching experiences, and not sort of, when you say teaching, not the first thing that people come to mind. Maybe just touch on some of that and why teaching was an important thing for you to get involved in.
Yeah, sure. So I think at the start you actually said it's going to be hard to introduce me because I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, but I think at the core of it all is teaching and learning. And so coaching is now teaching, and coaching is also learning and reflective practice. And the work that I do now, we're going to talk about the UPR project in a second, but it's still the same thing. It's teaching, it's learning. And even now being a father, it's teaching and it's learning from my son in how I can get better as a father and meet his needs and so forth. So that's probably at the core of everything I do, is teaching and learning. And it's interesting because a lot of the work that I do now is probably seeing the best in the kids that schools work with, or that teachers work with their students, is seeing the best in them. And you asked how I probably went down the pathway of becoming an educator. And I specifically remember when I was in year 7, a teacher of mine, Miss Cora, is her name. She just said to me one day, just a simple quote of, "Andrew, you'll make a great teacher one day." And the power of that sentence, or what she said to me in my own mind, in my own confidence, was probably the path that then set me on to wanting to become a teacher, wanting to become a leader and a learner. And I wasn't the greatest student at school. And even now, I'm not the greatest teacher. Like I don't think that I'm the greatest at actually pushing kids along a learning continuum. But that comment from Miss Cora of instilling belief in me is something that I'm really big on for teachers now, is instilling belief and confidence and self-esteem, like building up their self-esteem, because then that opens up their hearts to be able to learn. And that's probably what Miss Cora essentially did for me. So yeah, my teaching experience, I went to university and completed my Bachelor of Education. And in my final year of my teaching rounds, I did them at a school called Parkville College, which I think I mentioned a little bit earlier is the only school in Victoria that delivers education to children detained in youth custody. And there's got a few different sites around Victoria. There's one at Parkville for boys and girls that are anywhere between 10 and 18 years old. There's a site up at Malmesbury, which is for kids that are a little bit older, which is sort of 18 to 21. It's almost a bit of a last stop shop before they move on to adult prison. And then they've got some secure welfare units around Victoria as well, which are kids that are in the community that might be being abused or might be a threat to themselves or to others. It's separate to the courts. So they're not actually being sentenced to anything, but it's actually to keep them safe. And I initially went in there and was, obviously you're going into a prison for the first time, you're a little bit apprehensive. You probably only have the perspective of maybe what you see and hear in the news, or even your upbringing of like criminals, bad people, they go to prison. So that's what you're going to be dealing with. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And when you start to hear some of the stories of what these kids have gone through and some of the data and statistics around how they've ended up there, and out of home care and domestic violence and broken families and all this stuff that they come from, you quickly realize that it's just they're probably the most marginalized, traumatized and vulnerable young people in the state, who have gone down this pathway, not because they're bad people, but it's a survival mechanism, and it's probably their experience and their perception of the world, of what's happened to them. So in many ways, they've committed crimes, and you can't ever move past that. And you obviously feel sorry for the victims that those crimes have been committed to, but you've got to hold in your heart that these kids are also victims themselves. And when you see the other side of the fence, so to speak, by being in the prison, and you hear their stories and whatever, you start to empathize a little bit. And what you also see is, by teaching those kids in the classroom, is that they're no different to mainstream school kids. If they're given an opportunity to be a better version of themselves, again, treat a person as they are, they'll remain as they are. Treat a person as they could be, they'll become what they should be. You see the growth and the willingness to actually improve and get better. And that's what I saw in those kids, was going into an environment that isn't, probably not made for education or learning or anything like that. To have kids that had such trauma-saturated backgrounds sitting quietly in a classroom, open to learning, calm, still, and thriving, that's inspiring. And it's built a lot of the work that I do now into all facets of my life: coaching, teaching, parenting.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, or maybe you're a little apprehensive, and that maybe it's surprising to see the kids interact that way. And I think largely that's pardon because that part of the story, you just don't see it, right? You hear that the kids go into, juvenile, and you hear about what they did. You don't hear about the fact that, they came from a broken home or for whatever. And in some aspects, it's like, it's almost all they know. But then you see them in a situation where it's obviously very rare for them, because a lot of teachers has probably just sort of said, too much work, I'm not doing it. When you actually give them an opportunity, you do actually see the growth and the benefits from it. Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's not like some people might listen and say, well, my parents split up, or I experienced domestic violence and I turned out okay, it might be the truth, but I guarantee there's some part of you, if that's you, that is unresolved trauma. And there might have been a period in your life that you went down a bad path, or you experienced depression, or you might have anxiety, or there's complexities going on in your life that you might not necessarily be consciously aware of. The thing with these kids is, because the trauma is so prevalent in their life and it's almost so consistent on a day-to-day basis, we actually see it in their behavior. And as you said, we hear the crimes that they've committed and what they've done in the bad aspect of it, which is, again, you can't shy away from that. But we've got two options. We don't have the death penalty here in Australia, and nor should we, by the way. But you've got two options. These kids are going into prison. Adults are going into prison. Eventually, at some stage, they're coming out. So we have an obligation to actually go in there and work with them and make them better people, or they come out worse people if you do nothing about it. So this term, put them away, throw away the key, it just doesn't exist. And what people often want to do is we want to actually hide away and put bad people away and not deal with our own insecurities or our own troubles. And it probably makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves. And I ask people often, if you were judged on the worst thing that you ever did, and that's how people viewed you and that's how people treated you, how would you feel? And that might be that you've done drink driving. Now, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you even got caught. But what if you hit somebody and killed somebody and then you did a 5-year sentence, which some of our kids who have ended up in prison, that's the first offence that they've done, is drink driving, hit somebody, and they've ended up doing a sentence in there. Now, I'm sure that there's many people that have done that before. And if they were judged on that, haven't got caught. And if they were judged on that, if people knew that and they judged them on that, how would that make them feel? But we don't, though, because we see all these other positivities going on. If they're a great father, they're a great coach, they're a great whatever. But that's what we always need to hold with these kids, is not actually judging them on the worst thing that they've done. What can they actually do to be a better person in the future?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not your role. It's obviously not your role to, be the law, be the judge, be whatever it is. Your job as a teacher is to essentially, teach these kids. And I can understand that, obviously you mentioned that you can't push aside what they've done, But to a certain extent, you do have to. Otherwise, if you're going in there and you're saying, I can't push that aside, then what are you doing there, right?
Agree, yeah. And that was a big thing for us when we go in and work with the kids, is we didn't want to know what they'd done or the crimes that they committed, or we wanted to know who they were at their core as a human being and what their hopes were for the future. Because, as I said, they're coming out at some stage. So we had an obligation to ensure that they actually come back into society as better citizens, better people, able to contribute and connect and be a part of society, not excluded and pushed away. Because what the data shows us is that they're only going to get worse over time, and antisocial behaviour, the younger that it's performed and then not intervened in a positive way and given an opportunity to get better, that behaviour is only going to get worse. The crimes are only going to get worse. People often talk about it's costing taxpayers money. It's going to cost taxpayers more money if we continue to shun these people from society rather than working with them. And it's hard, like it is. It's hard to go and work with somebody who is apprehensive or is resistant to actually changing for positive behaviour. But again, if you have the understanding of where they've come from, what their perception is of reality versus what yours is, and you're not just simply going, well, why can't they be better? Again, understanding brain development, understanding what they've been through, it's going to give you perspective as to how you can actually help them get better as well. Yeah,
no, it is incredibly interesting stuff. And, you know, you could argue that perception for them is also what they've been through growing up, and then also their interactions with teachers. So a lot of teachers will probably say, like, you know, this kid's, you know, apprehensive, this kid's a pain. It's probably because the fact that he hasn't had good teaching experiences. And you always remember, like you touched on a teacher who sort of set something in motion for you. You remember the really good teachers you have. I can remember one, Stephen Pinner, who teach me. You remember the good ones like that, but you also remember the really bad ones as well. And I think a lot of times for kids at a young age, it's probably really hard for them to get over that.
Yep, spot on. And I bet you if I asked you the difference between those teachers, you wouldn't talk about academics. You would actually talk about how they make you feel. 100%. And that's what most students actually hold on to. Like, I can't remember much of actually what I learnt during my primary school and my high school, but I specifically remember how teachers made me feel. And this is the thing, right? This is really important to put in here. None of this is the teacher's fault. It's actually the system that it's built upon, where we've got teachers have so much pressure to push kids along a learning continuum, to make sure that curriculum's being delivered to class sizes that are 25 plus. And so they've got all these competing priorities. And then if they've got little Johnny over in the corner that's constantly disrupting the class and not enabling them to get through their lesson plan and through the curriculum to all the other kids, the easy thing to do is actually to kick that kid out of class. And what that does for that child is she starts to develop a negative association of school. They start to have low self-worth because they feel like they don't belong. And so that's what ends up happening is we have a community and they're excluded from that community. That's in a school environment. What that leads to later in life is the same thing. You have a community of people that work, that are respectful, that are socially appropriate. And then you have people that are somewhat outcasts, who are antisocial, who perform crime and whatever. And it starts in schools. And I'll give you a statistic that there's a report that 60% of kids in juvenile justice have been either expelled, excluded, or suspended from school. Now, that's disclosed data. So that's people that have actually willingly said, yep, this is I'm happy to be a part of this report. It's probably more likely that it is 95% of kids in juvenile justice have been expelled, excluded, or suspended from school. And what that leads to in adult prison is 90% of adults in prison in Victoria haven't completed secondary school. So essentially what we're doing by kicking our kids out of school, and the younger that we do it, the more prevalent it is and harder to turn around, is we're actually creating a pipeline from being kicked out of school to prison. And so what we do, we can touch on it in a second with the UPR project, is actually we want to try and keep kids in school, because there's another statistic, John Hattie, and the educators listening will know who John Hattie is, but he says that the kids long-term health success. So this is mental health and also just financial success, self-worth. It isn't the amount of success that they have in school, i.e. what enter score they get, did they get A pluses all the time, whatever. It's actually the number of years spent in school in an environment that is supportive, safe and welcoming. That is the determinant for greater mental health, financial success and self-worth.
Yeah. Jump into the UPR project now. I know this is a very important thing and something that I've only sort of, just found out a couple of days ago. Touch on that and sort of, I guess, why it's so important, obviously for all of those different reasons that you sort of talk about. It kind of answers it there, but maybe just sort of, explain, what went on behind it.
Yeah. So, as I said, I'm taught in the Juvenile Justice Centre for 4 years and developed a lot of my teaching philosophies and how I want to be as a human being, how I want to treat other human beings from that experience. And by the end of it, I actually developed some compassion fatigue, which is essentially hearing the stories of those kids day in, day out, and then doing a lot of really good work with them, pushing them out into the community, thinking that they're going to go and thrive and be good citizens. And then the recidivism rate is quite high for kids here in Victoria. So meaning that they come back to prison, after recommitting a crime, and you sort of see them come back almost at square one where you first met them. And that's really hard because you just feel for them, you empathize with them, and you know that their community environment they're actually going out into the world in is quite different to the one they've been exposed to in the youth prison, which is supportive. It's, they're surrounded by other people that are in the same situation as them, and then they go out into the world and they're sort of shunned. And so I developed compassion fatigue, as I said, and I went and taught in some mainstream schools for a couple of years. And what I found is that the behaviour presented by both students, challenging behaviour presented by both students in mainstream school and in the prison, on the surface, it's exactly the same. Now, the level of it and the frequency of it is obviously a lot more heightened in Parkville than it might be in mainstream school settings. Not always, though. There's some mainstream schools that have some heightened kids and some frequent behaviour that's challenging to deal with. But the way that the approach was towards the kids and the genuineness, the empathy, the unconditional positive regard, and trying to work those kids to keep them in schools and work them towards becoming better people was quite different. In Parkville, you probably knew that the kids come from a trauma background and therefore you could sort of accept the behaviour and empathise with them, not judge them on the bad stuff that they've done, but actually try and work them towards being a better person and not continuing that behaviour in the future. Whereas in mainstream school settings, as I said, they've got competing priorities. They've got to push curriculum, work kids along an academic continuum, deliver to all the other kids that are wanting to comply and do well in the classroom. And so we kick that kid out of class. And that actually doesn't do anything but give them negative association of school. It doesn't help them actually deal with the behaviour. It removes it for a short period of time. We put a Band-Aid over it, but that kid's coming back into the classroom will probably repeat the behaviour the next time. So I started actually running some workshops at the mainstream school that I was working at around how to deal with challenging and disruptive behaviour in a more therapeutic and inclusive way. And the benefits for those teachers was just phenomenal. And they were actually the ones that said to me, you should go and push this out to other schools. And this should be an approach that is used Victoria-wide. And so I reached out to my mentor, Brendan Murray, who was the founder of Parkville College. And I said, how would I go about sort of setting this up? And he actually came back to me and said, why don't we do it together? He has great credibility in the education industry. He's a justice and human rights advocate. He's done a lot of work with Parliament and a lot of work around policy of how to keep kids in school. And so what we came up with was the UPR project. And UPR stands for Unconditional Positive Regard, which I've mentioned a couple of times. And essentially what we're trying to do is go out to Victoria-wide. So we run workshops for educators right across Victoria around more therapeutic and inclusive strategies that work with challenging behaviour as opposed to excluding kids and sending them down that pipeline that I spoke about before. So we focus on 5 key learning areas: unconditional positive regard, attachment, emotional regulation, rolling with resistance, and modelling vulnerability as the things that we sort of talk about within our workshops. And then we also touch on the brain development and how that works. And we go into some case studies of kids that have experienced some trauma, and there's a case study. It's called Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what a lot of educators and people think is, on the surface, that kid's got it all figured out or whatever, but then we see disruptive behavior and we sort of just label it as naughty. So adverse childhood experiences are anything that is a child facing adversity, and they broke it up into sort of three big areas: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So household dysfunction could be things like substance abuse, parental divorce, incarcerated family member, things of that nature. So something that's going on in the house that could be disturbing or adversity that child has to face. And this is things that as educators, we might not necessarily know what's going on. And what the studies actually show is that 4 out of 5 students have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. Right? So if you think about a class of 25 children, that's 20 kids that have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. So their brain development, for example, or their perception of the world or what they deem as appropriate behavior, therefore might be a little bit skewed to what the educators' expectations are of that classroom. And further, that kids that have experienced at least 3 adverse childhood experiences, they're 32 times more likely to struggle in school. And so when we sort of present this data in this way and we take the educators through our workshops, it probably gives them a little bit of a light bulb moment for them to sort of say and look at kids and identify behavior, not based on that they're naughty, but based on maybe what might be going on under the surface. And I think that's the key, is to not just judge kids on surface level behavior, but actually look at behavior and say, what are they trying to communicate to me? What's going on for that child? And work with them to move forward.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I think back to my childhood and say certain things that happened, and, whether they be right or wrong, I didn't realize a lot of these things until I was an adult, where, it sort of hit me and I said, well, I don't know if that's a normal or whatever. But the thing is with kids, like, that they're not going to reach that for such a long time. And I think to put myself into a teacher's shoes, I don't know if that's something that I personally probably would, understand. If I've got 25 kids and I've got little Jimmy at the back, who's throwing stuff, doing whatever, my first reaction, and probably a good thing is why I'm not a teacher, is my first reaction would be like, out you go. Like, rather than say, why is he doing this? Because, and I can understand why some teachers are like this, whether it be right or wrong, is, they're probably looking at it and going, I got 24 kids here willing to learn. They're moving on to science after this. So I'm not going to spend 30 minutes with him trying to understand why he's throwing glue sticks at every other student. So it is a really interesting thing. And have you, I guess it's a really long point, have you found that some teachers have, come up to you and said, this has really opened my eyes?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to your point before I answer that part, is that none of this stuff is taught at university. So we're all taught at university about learning, best practice teaching and learning. And we have a thing in education called high impact teaching strategies. And so therefore, when we go into a classroom, we have a lesson plan and we need to get through that lesson plan. We've got 5 things that we need to get through. We've got time. Teachers are fantastic organizers of what they actually need to get through. And so when disruptive behavior or challenges are thrown into the equation, we go back to, well, I've got to get through this content, so little Johnny's going to go out. And there's no blame on the teachers here, because, as I mentioned before, there's so many competing priorities and we have to push them along the learning continuum. There's demands from up above that grades are high and so on and so forth. So none of this is the fault of the teachers. They're just dealing with the system that is in place. But here's an interesting thing about brain development, which we talk about, is our brain works from a hierarchical point of view, that all information's passed through our brainstem, which is at the bottom of our brain, to our limbic system, up to our prefrontal cortex. And when we run our workshops, we break the brain up into 3 parts: brainstem, limbic system, prefrontal cortex. The brainstem's function, first and foremost, is to ensure that we're safe. Our limbic system's function is to ensure that our emotions are regulated. Our prefrontal cortex is our cognitive or our executive functioning. That's our capacity to learn. And so what we do in education is we focus so much on learning and teaching and best practice, which is the top of our brain, but all information is processed from the bottom up. So if students don't come into a classroom and they're not feeling safe, they don't have their emotions regulated, you can bet your bottom dollar that their brain's shut off to learning. And so what we see is that if they don't feel safe, if they don't have their emotions regulated, these outbursts of behavior as a way to communicate and say, hey, I'm not feeling safe. I don't know what's going on. You're trying to teach me all this stuff. I'm overwhelmed. So therefore I'm going to act out. Okay. And then what we do is we label that as naughty behavior. We exclude the child from the classroom, and all we do is reaffirm the fact or the perception that's going on in their own head is that they don't belong, they can't learn, that they're not safe in that environment, they're not accepted for who they are. So that's the sort of stuff that we try and teach the teachers, is that you've got to make sure the kids are feeling safe first. You've got to make sure that their emotions are regulated, then they have capacity to learn. And I use the example of, if you think about it, whenever you walk into, let's say, even a bar, for example, and you're going in by yourself and you might be meeting your friends there, the first thing that you're doing unconsciously is going, right, where are my friends? Because you want to feel safe. You want to actually connect with people and go to an environment that actually makes you feel safe. You might have a sense of walking in and some people will actually stare at you, and that makes you a little bit anxious. You go, shit, they're looking at me at the moment. So now your emotional state, you're trying to regulate yourself. You're not thinking about what beer am I going to get? Okay, what's on the menu? What you're not learning. You're not thinking. You're actually, first of all, your function is going, I want to feel safe. I want to have my emotions regulated. And the power in that for our teachers, I think that was the second part of your question, is have we had teachers? I ran a workshop last week and one of the teachers actually said, I never knew that about the brain. But because we focus so much on learning intentions, success criteria, this is what you've got to do for the class. And we sort of unconsciously neglect the safety and emotion part, we probably miss out on our capacity to teach and learn. So it is quite powerful when teachers hear that. And the beauty of it is all this is just information that we're passing on. The teachers are the ones that are the champions here, because then they actually go and put this into practice. They actually work on stuff that they haven't been aware of before. And as I said, there's no blame on the teachers here, because unfortunately through our universities and our Bachelor of Education degrees, a lot of this stuff actually isn't taught about brain development and about safety, emotion, and then learning. It's all about, this is best practice. This is how you write a lesson plan. This is how you assess learning, rather than how do we make our children feel safe.
Would you say that's a goal of the project, to say run workshops at universities and then subsequently get that a part of the curriculum? Because I mean, when you sort of lay it out, and I understand that, developing a course curriculum is probably something that's very difficult, but there's often stuff that's missed. And a lot of the times when you're in the role doing it specifically, you'll say, why wasn't this covered? And this obviously is one of those things.
Yeah. And look, we haven't approached university. We haven't approached anyone really. We've sort of just marketed it out to our, to educators and to different regions of this is what we're doing. But I think I've had people on where, as part of our workshops, we actually have podcasts that we give to people that come along at the end. And I've had professors, I've had educators that have worked with vulnerable children. I've had Brent Ryan on, who obviously works as a senior education advisor at VACA, marginalised and neglected youth as well. And one question I ask all these people at the end of the podcast is, what's one thing that we can change in education? And it is how we teach our teachers. And so focusing less on, because here's the thing, right? Teachers are experts of identifying where a kid is at in terms of their skills and what they need to do to get better. Writing, numeracy, science, whatever subject is, that's what they're excellent at. What we're probably not so excellent at, again, no fault of their own, it's just not embedded at a university level, is how do we regulate their emotions? How do we make them feel safe? Do we understand brain development? Do we understand what's going on behind the surface for this child? And that's hopefully what our program is going to upskill their practice and balance out the excellence that they're already doing in terms of moving kids along the learning continuum for the skills that they need to do, but then also ensuring that they can come into a classroom every day and feel safe, have their emotions regulated, and feel like they're going to be given the opportunity to learn, because those 2 points have been hit on first.
Yeah, it's an absolutely incredible initiative, man. And I think it's probably the perfect way to finish up this. So I just want to thank you very much for coming on and talking a bit about, your the podcast Emergence, your coaching career, and then the large part of it is, sort of how you interact as a person and how it all translates into all those different aspects of your life. It's incredibly insightful for me. And once again, thank you very much. And I just want to wish you all the best with the podcast, coaching, and then with the UPR project as well.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate you having me on and giving me this platform. I think we touched on it throughout the show that podcasts are a great way to share people's stories, and the fact that you invited me on to be able to share mine. And that's all it is a story. So people are listening. Some people might connect with it. Other people won't. At the end of the day, that's my story and they're my beliefs and my philosophies, and hopefully it helps somebody. It's certainly going to help me talking it out like this, and hopefully it's helped you as well. So keep up the great work that you're doing as well.
No, I appreciate that. And if one person gets something out of it, mate, then that's really all you need. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.